Hello and welcome to Newscentre. I'm Parikshit Luthra. The Union Government has initiated preliminary discussions with the RBI and SEBI for amending rules to allow the creation of a sovereign wealth fund. Dozens of nations, including China, Japan, Norway, Gulf countries and the UK, have federal sovereign wealth funds that invest in assets across the world. The United States does not have a federal fund, but several states in the US have similar funds. Sources have said that the government recently sought views of over 30 PSUs about the possibility of success of such a fund. Officials privy to the discussion say that the government is considering a fund which can invest abroad via PPP mode. Sources also said that a sovereign wealth fund would boost India's capability to invest in infrastructure projects abroad. The government is considering whether a sovereign wealth fund would give India more leverage to support friendly countries than lines of credit and grants in aid. Joining us right now to speak about this development is Jayant Dasgupta, former Indian ambassador to the WTO. Ambassador Dasgupta, thank you very much for joining us. What do you think about such a move? Do you think this is something that India should do now, have its own sovereign wealth fund? Do you feel this is the right time and would generate a high amount of investor interest from abroad as well?
Well, if you take the conventional thinking on sovereign wealth funds, as opposed to the foreign exchange reserves, which are meant for stabilization of the economy and through short-term measures, a sovereign wealth fund is a long-term investment by a government from its own reserves and from its earnings from, let's say, commodities like oil or gas. So that is the conventional thinking. Now, if India were to strike a new path and try to leverage the very substantial sovereign foreign exchange reserves that it has, I think at the last count it was around $688 billion. Now, a part of it could be invested for infrastructure projects for which the government is providing finance through letters of credit, lines of credit, etc. And, for project exports also. So it could act as a kind of a leveraging factor for increasing our presence, for making it much more smoother for the beneficiary government or the country to utilize the funds.
Currently, whenever we want to invest in countries or give some sort of grants or assistance for infrastructure projects, as we've done in Afghanistan in the past, or in Bangladesh, or in African nations for that matter, it is always through lines of credit or grants in aid. Do you think this is a better option?
Well, it will depend on how we decide to operate it. Because in 2008, for instance, there was a declaration by a group of sovereign wealth funds, leading sovereign wealth funds, I think about 30 of them, called the Santiago Principles. So there are certain disciplines which you have to adhere to, even in operating sovereign wealth funds. So having said that, I think it can be very useful for India for using a sovereign wealth fund to finance specific infrastructure projects which are of mutual interest for India and the beneficiary country. And there would be some amount of, requirement to maintain transparency and accountability, because that is something which foreign governments have often raised about sovereign wealth funds. So there are concerns which will have to be addressed. There are also these competing, objectives. One is to make the flow of funds easier and smoother, and also avoid the commissions and the other things which creep into operating lines of credit, etc. And the second objective, of course, is the provision of the funds in such a way that it meets the requirements of the beneficiary country, and it does not impose unnecessary burdens on it.
Right. The government is also taking the view of PSUs in the country. Recently, we believe they met at least 30 to 35 PSUs and sought their views on such a proposal. What, according to you, will determine the success of any initiative around a sovereign wealth fund for India?
One of the areas which is emerging now is, the sourcing of critical minerals. And ONGC Videsh, for instance, and there are a few other agencies which have been tasked with exploring the possibilities of securing our critical mineral requirements for the future. Now, for that purpose, I think a sovereign wealth fund would be very useful, because rather than going through the regular banking channels and then being subjected to all kinds of scrutiny, it would be, and of course the attendant costs as well, it would be much better to invest through the sovereign wealth fund in such an endeavor. So this could be one example, but there could be other examples as well. For instance, we also want to secure our energy for the medium term, or let's say the next 2 decades, in terms of our supplies of oil and gas. Now, in that endeavor also, sovereign wealth funds can smoothen the whole process of investments. So, and especially in those countries which have a dearth of capital, which are looking out for capital, where India can step in, provide the capital, provide also technological help and human resources if required, and get a share of the eventual output of oil and gas.
All right. Ambassador Dasgupta, thank you very much for joining us on the program and giving us your views on India's move to consider a sovereign wealth fund. Early stages of discussion right now, but let's see what happens in the months to come. Moving on to another CNBC-TV18 exclusive. We learned from sources that the government is likely to finalize the FAME 3 scheme in the next 10 to 15 days. Sources say that the government is considering a proposal for an outlay of 11,500 crore rupees, and it may stagger or reduce incentives on each category over the 2-year period. The scheme is likely to have incentives for electric buses, 3-wheelers, 2-wheelers. New categories like electric trucks, tractors, mining equipment could also be included. Charging infrastructure will also be covered, but whether swapping stations, battery swapping is included in the policy, that remains to be seen. Meanwhile, Sun Mobility has announced that it will be introducing the world's first modular battery swapping technology for electric vehicles in partnership with Bangalore-based bus manufacturer Veera Vahan. I caught up with Chetan Maini, co-founder and chairman of Sun Mobility, and I began by asking him about the urgency of having a FAME 3 scheme right now and the importance of also covering incentives for battery swapping.
The key is trying to make sure that the policy is a technology agnostic approach to things around policy, subsidies, and the entire structure. This will sort of promote different forms of transportation and solutions within the ecosystem. And particularly, as you mentioned, the industry is looking forward to having battery swapping also get the concessions and the GST reduced that would help that industry tremendously. In addition, I think the country is really looking for a large rollout on infrastructure. So structures around public-private partnership around charging and swapping infrastructure will really help electric mobility's work. The first role of the government was pushing around product. Now there also needs to be a push on infrastructure. And I think the industry is also thinking, are there options around the new models? So we have 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers and buses that got a good push in FAME 1 and FAME 2. Can other forms of transportation, like the trucking industry, which contributes to almost 50% of the pollution of the country, can these industries now also sort of be brought in to the gamut of FAME 3 that can really help the decarbonization agenda of the government?
All right. Now, just to speak to you specifically about battery swapping, we know that the government is likely to incentivize or continue incentivizing setting up of charging infrastructure in the country. Any conversation with the government on incentivizing battery swap stations?
I think there is, in many classes, the charging infrastructure is considered both swapping and charging, right? But there is some lack of clarity in some of the policies. And that's what I meant to say, if it's technology agnostic at the policy level, and if charging and swapping stations are brought into the same gamut, then, it's a uniform policy. So if at a petrol station, there's a charging infrastructure and a swapping infrastructure, both should get the right benefits so that they both support the ecosystem. So we're hoping that FAME 3 corrects some of these anomalies that really helps these concessions also come through people who are putting up the swapping infrastructure in the country.
And finally, give us a sense of how Sun Mobility is going to further invest in swapping infrastructure in the country. Any collaborations that you're considering?
So as you're aware, we've our recent announcement with Indian Oil Company, they've invested over $78 million in the company, and over the next 3 years through our joint venture, which is a 50-50 joint venture, have committed to over $220 million. So with IOCL having 37,000 outlets across the country, we're rapidly expanding that. In fact, in the next 6 to 8 months, we're looking at doubling from over 1.7 million swaps that we do a month to over 3.5 to 4 million swaps per month. So we're really expanding the infrastructure for the country, and also recently showcased our solutions for heavy electric mobility at the Pravas event in Bangalore, which would go for trucks and buses all the way from 3 tons to 55 tons. So both in one side, we're looking at 2- and 3-wheelers that constitute 80% of the vehicles in India, and the other for trucks and buses that have 50% of the energy and emissions in the country. These are the areas where it's the highest level of decarbonization, where swapping makes a huge difference to the end customer, and we're working to just expand these networks on both sides.
All right, so electric vehicle ecosystem awaits the FAME scheme, and players like Sun Mobility are hoping there will be policy incentives and interventions for battery swapping stations in the country as well. We're taking a short break here on Newscentre, but lots more when we return.